acceptance. Diversity is acceptance.
Diversity is life.
Diversity is understanding.
Diversity is priceless.
Acceptance.
All people working together.
Infinite.
Unity. Most definitely unity.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to another wonderful DLA Equity and Inclusion Workshop. My name is Tondra Richardson, the Director of Student Diversity and Inclusion at the University of Phoenix, and also a proud DLA board member. This year, I have the privilege of serving as the DLA Education Committee Chair. My committee and I are excited about bringing you innovative and forward-thinking DEI content and subject matter experts that will help impart change and move the needle on systemic racism. This is the year we raise our collective voices loud enough to drown out the hate. The time is now to have brave conversations that can turn stumbling blocks into stepping stones. This morning's workshop analyzes critical steps you can take now to put your DEI strategy to work. Before we begin today's DLA webinar, I'd like to acknowledge and identify the Indigenous peoples, nations, and histories within our area. We acknowledge the Akimel Otham, Pipash, and Yavapai. We acknowledge these people, their ancestors, their descendants, and the land itself. Before we dive into more detail about today's workshop and meet the lovely Deanna Singh, I would like to remind you about our upcoming 21st Annual Conference and Awards Ceremony. At Diversity Leadership Alliance, our goal has always been to provide a safe and open forum for diversity, inclusion, equity, and social justice dialogue. As the premier diversity education organization in Arizona, we believe that organizations that understand, recognize, and value diversity both attracts and retains top talent and has a strong competitive advantage. Our 21st annual DLA Conference is a continuation of the great work we have been putting in each month in hopes that we'll turn difficult conversations into brave ones, that stumbling blocks into stepping stones that ultimately lead to change. This year's hybrid conference will be held from October 12th to October 14th, and we are happy to announce that general admission ticket sales are open. Please see the link in the chat area to purchase your individual tickets today. We are ecstatic about the dynamic and global group of presenters we have secured this year who will be joining us from Puerto Rico, Australia, and Costa Rica. Workshop titles and topics include belonging and connecting, cancel culture, mindfulness, and the intersection of ableism and racism. Presenting sponsors for this year's conference include USAA, SRP, Mayo Clinic, Channel 12 News, and as a new presenting sponsor for this year, my employer, the University of Phoenix. Select sponsorship levels are still available. Now let's move back into the focus of today's webinar. Our 7th DLA webinar in our 2022 Brave Conversation series examines steps you can take now to put your DEI strategy to work. Before we bring our speaker on, we'd like to provide a gentle reminder that Diversity Leadership Alliance is a community space. And as such, we want to ensure that our programs and events are always inviting, respectful, and accessible to all. So before we get started on today's program, just a few reminders about these rules for engagement. So you see the rules here on the screen. Just a quick reminder to everyone here that our duty at DLA is to keep this space safe, positive, and productive. Listen actively and be open to the full spectrum of perspectives. Commit to foster greater empathy. Try to relinquish the need to be right. Ask questions and seek clarification for understanding. Be respectful to the presenter and other attendees. No one or two individuals should dominate a discussion, and approach each other with kindness and love. As a community space, we reserve the right to remove you from the discussion if you become disruptive. We also want to let you know that this presentation is being recorded and that by entering the event, participants are consenting to be recorded and for the recorded presentation to be shared on Diversity Leadership Alliance's webpage, our YouTube channel, and other professional media. Today, we have ASL translation being provided by Equal Access Services with interpreters Heather Ivy and Elizabeth Blake signing for us today. A very special thank you to Dave Wallenhoff and his amazing team from the Equal Access Services for the years of continued partnership and support. We value all of your time. So if you need to leave early, please save this survey link to share your thoughts with us. If you're able to stay until the end, it should launch automatically. Now let's talk about what we're going to discuss today. Many companies have found themselves searching for guidance on creating diverse, equitable, and inclusive workplaces that translate ideology into action. Many organizations fall short of that action plan because they lack a crucial tool, a comprehensive blueprint that examines their surroundings and corporate cultures with new eyes. Essentially, this allows them to get out of their own way and turn their energy into a concrete plan. In this hands-on webinar, accomplished author, educator, and business leader Deanna Singh will provide a step-by-step guide for managers, teams, and DEI leaders from her new book, Actions Speak Louder. She'll share key strategies for creating impactful, lasting change in your organization at all levels, from recruitment to retention and beyond. Get ready for this content-rich dialogue that will provide you with new and innovative tools that you can use now to put your DEI strategy to work and create an inclusive workplace. Please allow me to introduce today's webinar presenter, Deanna Singh. As I mentioned before, she is an accomplished author, educator, business leader, and champion for marginalized communities. As the founder, chief agent of Flying Elephant, Deanna consults with individuals and companies that are looking to make a positive difference in the world. As a social entrepreneur at her core, Deanna is always at the forefront of social change. She has established and operated multiple social innovations, including the New York City office of Lyft, which helps people find a way out of poverty for good, Milwaukee's street law program, an interactive legal program that has taught over 1,000 Milwaukee students basic legal knowledge, and a birth coach, Milwaukee, which provides doula services for women who otherwise could not afford them. Deanna earned her Bachelor of Arts degree in Urban Studies from Fordham University, a Juris Doctorate from Georgetown University, and a Master's in Business Administration from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She's also the author of 2 children's books, I Am a Boy of Color and I Am a Girl of Color, and 2 business books, Purposeful Hustle and Actions Speak Louder. Now, before I give this warm and gracious welcome to Miss Deanna Singh, I want to add a little personal note to the bio that I honestly just read to you. I have begun to follow Deanna's work after she and I met maybe about 2 years ago virtually. I can tell you she is a fantastic woman. That bio that I just read did not encompass all of the work that she does. I personally would invite you to follow her on LinkedIn. The work that she's doing is phenomenal, and it is far-reaching, much farther beyond organizations, much farther beyond some of the communities that she's working in, and I invite you to take part in that. So now, without further ado, I introduce Deanna Singh.
Well, thank you so very much for that warm welcome, Tandra. I really appreciate you. Also a fan of yours and a fan of all the work that you do. I'm also a really big fan just of DLA. It has been phenomenal to see this organization really take the reins on what it means to create the most inclusive workplaces and making sure that you can provide that content. So big shout out to the entire team for the invitation to join you all again. And big shout out to everyone who is on the line with us. It is always awesome to be able to have these kinds of conversations. For the last couple of months, I have been on a worldwide tour with the book, and it's been phenomenal just to hear how people are taking these ideas and really extending the conversation around inclusion in their workplaces. So I'm excited about being here, but I'm really excited to hear what you end up doing with some of the things that we talk about today. So a couple of things I just wanted to point out, and I won't spend much time here because I know that Tandra just did a beautiful introduction, but I did want to share just a little bit about what our company, Uplifting Impact, does. So Uplifting Impact really focuses on three big things. First, we do coaching. So we spend a lot of time, especially with executive leaders who are trying to understand how they can incorporate some of these ideas into their toolkit. Another thing that we do is consulting work. So really helping organizations take those big ideas and turn them into strategy, and then providing learning and development and training. Now, there's a couple of special projects that are listed here that I just want to know. One of them is our How to Be an Ally Summit. That is going to be March 1st through the 3rd of next year. It's an awesome opportunity. It's all virtual, but what we do is we have 3 full days of a conference that really focuses on this idea of allyship, because we all know that when we are thinking about how we can show up and what we can do as individuals, as allies, is amazing. And so really that conference is a focus on that. Every week we have an Uplifting Impact podcast. So if this is an area that you want to learn more about, we get to talk to some of the industry's leaders really in the space of inclusion and have a ton of fun on the podcast. So I would invite you to join us there. You'll see that there's a logo here for one of our signature programs, which is our DEI Strategy Accelerator. So one of the things that we do is we actually step into organizations and we become, in effect, their chief diversity officer. So really helping them implement some of the ideas that they have and kind of thinking through their baseline and where they're trying to go. You'll also notice that the Wisconsin School of Business is listed here because we have both written and are delivering their professional certificate in diversity, equity, and inclusion. And last, but certainly not least, I know it's not often that you see on somebody's capabilities a children's book, but I'm very proud to be in partnership with American Girl as their one of their lead consultants. I have helped them put 3 products into market. I have a special project I'm working on with them right now, super secretive. But I also was able to write one of their latest books, which is called The Girl's Guide to Race and Inclusion. So just, mentioning it because one, I'm super proud of that partnership, but also because it's just been an amazing resource to be able to see and have these conversations with young people, with educators, and obviously with all of the clients that we have in the business world also. Now, the reason why I share all of this is one, because of course I would love for you to join us and to participate in some of the things that we offer. But 2, it's really because I want you to know that what we are going to talk about here today and the conversation that we're going to have is not something that I was just, sitting around like, I don't know, let me make up something that I could tell my friends at DLA. No, what we're going to talk about here today are things that I have seen over and over and over again. The things that I experience every single day, sitting as a chief diversity officer or writing or talking to, the industry's leaders. And so what I'm hoping to do in this conversation is really help condense down some of the greatest hits, right? Some of the greatest tools, and make sure that I can share those with you. So I always tell people the reason why I share some of our capabilities, like the main reason, is for street cred, right? I just want you to know that I'm here and what we're talking about is real. And so again, glad to have you here. So excited to be able to have this conversation with you. So what we're going to do with our time today is first, we're going to talk about the cost of exclusion. And I'm very excited to be able to share with you a pretty personal story. And I'm going to share something that happened to me that I think illuminates this cost of exclusion and what we mean by the cost of exclusion. And then what I want to do is I want to talk to you about setting an inclusionary table. And this is where I'm going to give you some real tips tips and some tricks and some things that you can start to implement literally the minute that you end this call. So we'll talk about some of the tips and tricks that you can use in order to create a more inclusive table. I will always end with a challenge for those of you who have been with me before and some of the other learning that we've done together. So we'll make sure that there's an opportunity for that. And my favorite part is actually opening up for Q&A. So if you have any questions, we would just ask that you go ahead and submit your questions. The team has so graciously agreed to collect those questions and then be able to facilitate a Q&A at the end of our session. So hopefully you're all still with me and you're ready to go on this agenda. The first thing that I want to do is I want to share with you a story about the cost of exclusion. And I want to share a story that is really a very personal story for me. So in order to understand this story, you kind of need to know where I was in my career. So I was at the point where I was doing a lot of investments. My primary job was to meet with organizations that wanted to move forward, who were looking for financial infusions, and to talk to them about what their ideas were and what they were looking to do and how they were going to implement those ideas. And I remember there was this one day, an organization actually reached out to me and said, oh, we'd like to present to you. We have this great idea. And so we set up the meeting. They came, they had this beautiful PowerPoint. They gave me their deck and all of the information, their financials. And I remember reviewing it and this, and reviewing what they asked for. So the group had come and asked for $100,000. And after reviewing it, I called them back and I said, hey, I just want to let you know, I looked at everything and I am not going to give you $100,000. Instead, what I'd like to do is give you $1.6 million. Now, you can imagine, right, how the organization responded to that. That was the largest gift that they had ever been given. And so, of course, there was this great deal of excitement around being able to elevate their organization. And I was excited too, because I could see that if the organization was able to do the things that they were dreaming about, they could have a substantial impact on our community at large. And so very excited to work with them. And, we did all the things that you have to do when you're doing your due diligence, right? We looked and did all the prospecting, and we went through all the materials that they presented. And in addition to giving the money, we also decided to add some technical assistance, some prime real estate, to pay for a couple of additional executive leaders in their organization. So by the time the package was all done, it was worth well over that $1.6 million. And after we had gone through all of our due diligence, I wrote the check. So I wrote the check, I signed my name, and I folded it up and put it into my purse. But there was one step that we had to do before I could literally give them the check. One step that we had to do that really shouldn't have been a big deal at all. It was, pretty perfunctory. We needed to have their board vote on whether or not they were going to accept this investment. Now, again, we had done all this work and been working back and forth. And so again, it should have kind of just been like yeah, absolutely, we're going to move forward. But I remember calling the CEO of the other organization. And when I called the CEO, I said, so look, I'm really excited about this board meeting. I know that we've all been working, your team and my team have been working really hard to get us to this moment. I really don't want there to be any surprises. Is there anything that you think we need to do in order to make sure that we get a unanimous approval from the board? And I remember the CEO on the other line said, well, Deanna, actually, this is the best work that my board has seen in the last 20 years. And I thought, okay, fantastic, right? That is exactly what you want to hear when you're going into a meeting like this. And the team had worked really hard. So I wasn't surprised by that comment. But again, kind of being the person that I am, I had to ask a follow-up question. I said, are you sure? Are you sure there's nothing else that I can do to make sure that we get this unanimous approval? And the CEO of the other company, reminding you here that, this was the investee, I was the investor, but the CEO of the other company took a deep breath and said, Deanna, I really hate to say this, but I think you should bring a white man with you. Now I'm going to let that sit for just a second, because I can't see your faces, but I can imagine what your faces might be doing in this moment. There might be a little bit of shock, a little bit of, wait, really? Did she just say that? Did that CEO just say that? And I have to tell you that for me, in that moment, I had that exact same reaction, right? There was a sense of frustration. There was a sense of anger. There was a sense of disappointment. There was a lot of emotions that were, but yes, I was really in my emotions. And I can see some of the comments here. I'm not shocked. My mouth is still open, right? And I had both of those, right? Both of those moments. Now, if I'm, assuming correctly that you're with me on my story, you're probably wondering what I did, right? What did I do in that moment after having someone tell me that I essentially was not enough, that I needed to, even though I was bringing, more than $1.6 million with me, that I was not going to be enough to show up at that board meeting. And so it certainly felt a lot of different things. And I'm sure you're wondering, well, what did you do, Deanna? Like, what did you end up doing? And I cannot wait to tell you. No, actually, I can wait to tell you, because I'm not going to tell you until the end. So hopefully you will stick with me as we kind of go through some of these techniques, because what I want to do before I tell you what I ended up doing is I want to talk about how we could actually shift the conversation and some of the techniques that you could use that would make it kind of impossible for that CEO to feel like that was an appropriate thing to say, or to feel like they needed to say it in the first place. So before we get there, I just want to talk a little bit more about the cost of exclusion, because I really want to pinpoint some of the things that were being left on the table and some of the things that were actually in jeopardy in this moment. Now, the first thing that was in jeopardy is pretty obvious, right? And that is that there was a financial impact of what could have happened and what certainly I could have done, because in that moment, the risk was that I could take that check, rip it up, and dispose of it, right? And completely just wash my hands of the deal altogether. That was 100% within my realm of power. And so it was clear, right, that in this moment, that organization, because of the culture that they had inside of the organization, was putting themselves at a financial risk. But there are many other risks that also came up as a result. The second risk that's up here is this idea of recruiting. Now, one thing that we certainly know is that when we are talking about what happens within organizations and how we find people and what that looks like, one of the big things that motivates an organization to be able to, or an individual to join an organization, is around what their goodwill is, right? How people talk about the organization, what is actually happening, or what are some of the stories that are shared. Mind you, right, one of the things that I have done over the course of my career is spent a lot of time in helping people navigate through their career paths. One entire company of ours is called Purposeful Hustle, where we spend a lot of time doing that kind of work. And so when you think about, well, what is, the reputation that we're putting out there, there's a huge, huge risk that's being left on the table. And I would say that it's even bigger than just what we could do in recruiting people, but it also goes to just brand reputation in general. Over the course of the last 3 months, I have talked to over 200,000 people. Now, I don't always tell this story. For those of you who know me, I tell a lot of different stories. I think storytelling is a great way for us to understand the reality of some of the big concepts that we're talking about. But I tell this story enough that if I were to actually disclose the name of the organization, it could have a pretty significant impact on that organization's ability to thrive. Right? So I wouldn't do that, but it is important to understand that when we're having these exclusionary behaviors and they're part of our culture, what we are doing is putting our brand reputation at risk. Another thing that was clearly at risk in this moment was the opportunity to have future investments. Now, the way that the investment world works, but the way that it works in almost every sector, is that people talk. Right. So at the time where I was doing this, and this was one of my primary responsibilities, one of the things that people would do is they'd call and they'd say, "Hey, Deanna, so I know that they pitched to you. What did you think? Right? What would you recommend? Or why didn't you decide that you wanted to move forward with them?" So they were also putting this ability to create future investment or future interest in their organization at risk. And then there's just overall marketability. Right now, we live in a world where people are able to consume a lot of things based off of their individual desires and needs. And when an organization has the kind of reputation or the way that they're presented or the way that people feel about them starts to move towards this exclusionary rhetoric, it implicates or it makes it more challenging for you to get into the market and have that great marketability that says and welcomes people to join you and welcomes people into the fold. So the reason why I just laid all these things out on this board table is because I think that one of the things we forget sometimes is that there's a real cost in our reputation and what we can do financially and who we can bring to the table as potential team members or colleagues or partners when we have exclusionary behaviors. And so I think it's important to just name that this is not just like oh man, that made Deanna feel bad kind of a moment. This is a wow. It has an incredible impact on the way that we want to show up and how we want to do business. Now, these are the costs, but I also think it's really important and maybe even more important to emphasize, well, what are the benefits, right? What are the benefits of us having an inclusionary workforce? And there's a couple of things that I want to highlight. Now, I will disclose that if you want more insight into all the benefits, the latest book, Actions Speak Louder, is chock full of research that I did for you. You're welcome, on all the benefits of inclusion. But one of the things I wanted to do was just highlight some of the ones, and I know people are coming from all different spaces, but highlight some of the ones that I think are important no matter what sector we're in or where we are in our organization. So the first one that I want to highlight is this idea that inclusion is really good for growth. Inclusion is really good for growth. Inclusive organizations are 70% more likely to capture new markets. So when you are in a space and you're trying to think about how do I compete, and there's more people who have entered into our sector and we want to make sure that we are really standing out, it's important to understand that inclusion is a key component to being able to activate in new markets, but also be able to be, considered a viable option in those new markets, right? For people to be attracted to you in those new markets. The second one that I have up here is that inclusion is innovation. Now, I had to reread this study like 10 times, right? Because I really wanted to understand the research that went behind getting this number, because it's a pretty high number. Inclusive teams make better decisions 87% of the time. Now, in this research study, what they did was they looked deeply at how teams actually come to decisions. And one of the things they recognized was that when you had a diverse team, right, people who are coming from different backgrounds, thought differently, different experiences, what ended up happening is that you had a little bit more friction, right? Because people had more questions. There wasn't a lot of just assumptions of, oh yeah, that's how we always do it. That's how I've always done it. That's the only way I've seen it done. And so there was a little bit more friction, but that the end result actually led to greater innovation and better decision-making because they were getting a different view of perspectives. And this kind of makes sense, right? If you think about it, because if you go into a room and we always say you don't want to surround yourself with yes people who are just going to say yes, 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 yes to every idea that's out there. You want to have people who are at the table who are going to push things, right? And for you to figure it out in the planning and not after you've tried the execution, to make your mistakes kind of at the beginnings where you have some opportunities to pivot and to correct. Well, that's exactly what happens. And that's why there's greater innovation and better decision-making, because a lot of that can get filtered out and people can kind of like share different opinions and different ideas. And that leads to better decisions overall and a lot less of that, just, kind of rubber stamping everything that comes up. The next one on here is inclusion is profit. So inclusion is profit. Now, one of the things that I really appreciate about this is that I do think that sometimes we spend a lot of our time talking about inclusion or diversity, equity, belonging, all of these concepts as really like the thing that is part of our moral compass, that we do these things because we know that we should be doing them. And I think that that is all fine and good. But I also think it's really important to understand and to articulate and help people see that when we talk about this, we're also talking not just about the moral implications, but we're also talking about the business implications. Right here, this is just one of many, many, many statistics out there that show that if we were able to create more inclusive environments, we would actually be able to realize more financial gain. And so when we're having these conversations, it's important to understand that that is not only a talking point, but that's the reality of what all of the research shows us. And the last one up here is inclusion is retention. Now, this, of course, makes a ton of sense if we just think about it. If we think about the fact that right now, when you get up and you go to work, right? Just think about it personally. If you love what you do and you love where you work and you feel like you can thrive and you feel like the people who are at work care about you, you are much more inclined to keep coming back. That just makes sense. So this one shouldn't surprise anyone, but this, fact that I share here around retention is that if you have an inclusive company, right, you are able to exhibit those skills on a day-to-day basis, you are 5 times more likely to be able to retain your people within your organization. In this moment in time, in particular, right now, where everyone is worried about recruiting and hiring and retention, and everybody's worrying about how competitive it is out there, and it is really competitive to be able to find people and be able to keep people with the great resignation that's happening all around us. It's important to understand that we need to put just as much energy in our recruiting and trying to get people to join as we are putting in our retention. And really, when we put that energy towards retaining people through inclusive strategies, we're going to be able to reap the benefits. So hopefully we talked a lot about, right, what are the challenges and what makes it difficult and what are some of the costs. But hopefully, especially through this slide, you can see that there's also some really clear benefits for inclusion. Now, I would invite you, if there's other things that you've used as part of your discussions with people within your organizations that you've considered to be like part of that business case, right? Part of what makes this really a powerful thing for us to do. I would encourage you to go ahead and share with your fellow attendees. So oftentimes, right, at this point in the conversation, when I'm talking about all the many benefits that happen as a result of inclusion, one of the big things that people will ask me is they'll say, well, Deanna, if everything is it's so clear that the benefits are there, then why aren't we actually seeing more inclusive workplaces, right? Like what is happening that we don't see more people jumping to create more inclusive workplaces? Well, here is what I have gathered, right? In all these conversations and doing all this work for many years, there's a lot of different reasons why inclusion doesn't come up to the forefront, but there are 3 kind of big obstacles that I see over and over again. The first one is really just around fear, right? There is this fear out there, and the fear manifests itself in many, many different ways. But one of the biggest ways that I see this fear manifesting itself, and I would say, especially in like the last couple of years, as this conversation has risen in the priorities of organizations, is that if we start, talking about our most marginalized communities within our organization, then aren't we by nature of having that conversation excluding other people, right? So a lot of times inclusion is created as this either or option. Either we're supporting marginalized communities or we have to, we have to let go of other communities that exist within our organization. And I think that is, I understand it. I know where it comes from. I can see it coming at me like a mile away. But I also think that it's actually not accurate. And when you look at really great inclusion strategies, and when you look at organizations that do inclusion well, you realize that this is really an unfounded fear, because inclusion, by its very definition, is meant to be something that actually supports the growth and development of everybody. Now, I like to use this example because I think it's one of the easiest ones for us to all, get our heads around. This example of what happens when we talk about this fear of either or, right? And as opposed to and, which is what I think inclusion should really be focused on. So when we first, everybody knows kind of this idea of curb cuts, right? So when you're walking down the street and you're about to go onto the street from the sidewalk, there are these curb cuts that are connected to the street to the sidewalks. And what they do is they go down on a ramp and they allow for people to descend off the sidewalk into the street without having to take a step. Now, initially, this is the history behind how curb cuts came into effect here in America. Initially, they were started after World War II. And the main audience, the primary kind of thing that people were thinking about when they put these curb cuts into effect were for veterans. And the idea was that there was a lot of veterans who were coming back and they might be in wheelchairs. And so it would be much easier for them to be able to move around if they could have these curb cuts. Now, when this came out and the idea first, came to the forefront, there was a lot of pushback. This is such a small group. Why would we do this for this small group? It's going to cost us so much. It's going to be dangerous. Why, all these different reasons. We've never done it before. Why would we start doing it now? But one of the really interesting things as a result of curb cuts, which are like everywhere now, it's, you don't even stop to think about it. You just kind of see them everywhere, is that it actually didn't just benefit veterans, right? Who else did it benefit? Well, if you're pushing a stroller, if you have a cart, I don't know, but if you're one of these people or you see these people, right, who are just texting and walking at the same time, it's benefiting all of those different groups. And that is really a great way for you to think about how inclusion strategies should be put together. And it's one of the kind of litmus tests that we use as an organization. When we are thinking about inclusion strategies, of course, we want to think about what is happening with our most marginalized communities. But when they're right for the organization, they should be impacting and positively impacting marginalized communities as well as communities who are making up the majority within the organization. And so I think that that's one thing that if we just shift our minds, we can kind of get away from that fear. Another thing that we see quite often in this space when it comes to, what are some of the fears that people experience? The second one is really around lack of knowledge. Okay, so we'll have a lot of people who will say, I'd really like to get more involved in being, and advocating for more inclusion, but I just have not read all the books. I don't know all the right words. I'm not exactly sure what all the strategies are. I didn't get formal training in this. And so I just don't feel like I am the, person, or I am a person that can bring this information forward. But here I just want to share another thing that I think is really beautiful and really awesome about the work of inclusion. Inclusion doesn't really require any special title. It does not require any, level of pedigree or years on a job. Inclusion actually is something that every single person can be involved in. Now, I'll tell you a cute little story here. So I'm on this book tour, right? And I have two children, and one of my children is 10 years old, and he kind of a quiet guy, not, I wouldn't say he's necessarily introverted, but he's not hey, I'm here. He's kind of in between, right? Those two things. And I remember on the last day of school, I was actually traveling. I was doing a big keynote presentation in another state. And I called my husband just to hear, how did the last day of school send off go with the boys? And my husband said, well, it was the last day, so I wanted to treat them. So I took them to the grocery store and I let them buy a treat, right? Like something that they could take with them to school that day, or breakfast or something like that. And I said, oh, that's really cool. He said, yeah, but a really interesting thing happened. So the night before, my sons had come with me and I'd done this TV interview. And one of the questions was around this, right? Like how, if I don't really know enough, how can I actually go in? And I said, well, everybody has the ability to be inclusive. We have to think about all the places that we go every single day and the way that we interact with people. Those are all moments for us to be inclusive. So I shared this the night before. My son had heard it and obviously internalized it, because my husband said that the next day when they were at the grocery store, my kind of reserved, a little bit more quiet son walked into the grocery store, and every single person that he met, he spoke to. So he talked to the person at the front, he talked to everybody in the aisles, he stopped and asked people how they were doing, he talked to everybody as they were coming out of the door. And, my husband said it when they got back in the car, he said, well, hey, I realized you were talking to every single person. Like, what was that all about? And my son said, very matter-of-factly, I was just practicing my inclusion strategies. Which I thought was so cool and 100% right on, right? We all have different spaces that we enter into on a daily basis, whether it's in the grocery store or how we greet people in our office or what, we do during our meetings. And so how do we really take, instead of thinking about what we don't have, how do we take an abundance mindset and think about what we do have in the spaces that we do enter into and the knowledge that we do have about what we know makes people feel included, and how do we use those moments to really practice our inclusion? So that's the second one. And the third one is really this perception of power. And this one is the one that I hear probably the most often when I'm having one-on-one conversations with people who are really enthusiastic about inclusion, but feel like they can't really move in this space. And it really comes down to this idea that, you know what? I'm not the CEO of the company, or I don't run the department, or I've only been here for a couple of months, or maybe I've been here for a really, really long time. And I know there's a lot of new people. And so I don't feel like I have the power to be able to lead some of these conversations around inclusion. And what I just want to tell you right there is that that's actually not accurate either. Because again, every single one of us has different spaces and different places that are within our sphere of influence. Whether that's in our community, whether that's in our family, whether that's at the grocery store, or whether that is actually in our teams. And so we're going to play with this idea and this perception of power, because I'm going to show you how you can use techniques that are really simple techniques to get over some of those moments where you feel like you might not have the power or might not have the ability to actually effectuate change. So hopefully you can see, right, that these are all the reasons, or not all the reasons, but these are like the top 3 reasons that I often hear of why people don't feel like they can be more inclusive. But one of the things that we want to make sure that we're focusing on is that you can actually do these things. You don't have to have the fear. It doesn't matter if you haven't read all of the books, and that no matter where you sit or kind of what your background is, everybody has power. And so we're going to really show you in these techniques what that looks like and how it can manifest in your day-to-day work. So there's a couple of big questions that I think it's important for us to ask, right? And for us to think about as we are thinking through what it looks like to actually create the kinds of inclusive tables, not like that board table I was going to, but to create the inclusive tables that could have reimagined what that story would have turned out to be that we started with, right? That would have reimagined kind of what that culture even looked like. And there's 2 like big overarching questions that I want to share with you today. But the first question I want to get at is this question around who is at the table? Who is at the table? So a lot of times we are, at different tables. And when you think about table, I want you to be thinking about this as where are the spaces where you are spending most of your time. In particular, we're going to be focused kind of on this workplace idea, but where are the places that you're spending most of the time? So that might be in your cubicle or office space. That might be on your Zoom calls. That might be in your meetings. But where are the tables that you are either sitting at or that you know of that exist within your organization? And I want you to start thinking, and it might even be, and this one should get everybody, right? But it might even be the lunch table. Right? What is happening within your organizations at all of these different metaphorical, not just physical, but sometimes physical tables? And I want you to ask this first question: who is at the table? And here are 3 techniques that will help you better identify what you're doing when you're answering these questions. So the first technique is around naming the exclusions. So naming the exclusions. Now, this is what I mean by this. A lot of times when we are working with organizations, this is one of the first things that we have them do. We say, we want you to help us understand who is not being invited to the table, who is not showing up at the table, whether that's your clients, whether that's in, people you're trying to recruit to the organization, whether that's customers, whether that's partners, who is not at the tables that you put out, right? Like who is not showing up? And why this is so interesting is that so often when we're asking this question, it becomes very apparent to us that there's a lot of people who are not at the table. But nobody really, or maybe the people who are sitting at the table didn't really realize that they were there. So just a couple of weeks ago, I was with an executive and we were walking through their building, and we actually were at the cafeteria. So there's like this window and we were looking into the cafeteria, and he was pointing out to me that when he looked into the cafeteria, this is a company that was an engineering firm. He said, what I see every time I walk past this window is that all of my foreign-born engineers are sitting separate from my American engineers. And he said, I see this day after day after day. And what's really concerning to me about this is that I know that in order for them to solve for some of the really big things that we are trying to solve for here at the engineering firm, they need to be able to have conversations together, right? That a lot of what they're doing doesn't just happen in the design room, doesn't just happen when they're looking at a whiteboard, but a lot of it happens when they're just having those extended conversations with one another. And so I know that by looking in this room, what we are doing is we are impacting our ability to actually build the kind of trust that is the bedrock of our organization, right? It is the bedrock of what we could be doing for our innovation. And so when I see this, this is probably one of the biggest fears that I have. Now, what's fascinating about naming exclusions is that a lot of times when we have this idea of naming exclusions, people don't even realize what they're not, what they don't have, right? Like what they're missing until they have to go through this exercise. And so what I would want you to do as you're thinking about those places that you occupy is I first want you to just like really stop and think, who's not showing up, right? Who is not actually represented at the tables that I sit at? What are the exclusions that are happening, and how might that actually be impacting the results that we're getting from the organizations or from the kinds of things that we're trying to achieve? So that's step number one, when you're thinking about who's at the table. The next thing I want you to do is I want you to think about where are the places that we are actually looking when we're thinking about who we're extending invitations to. Okay, so who are we actually extending invitations to? A critical component in this process, because I think that it's really, really, really hard for you to assume that you're going to be able to invite more people if you keep looking in the same spaces. So let me share what I mean by this and kind of how this showed up in one of our client spaces. So I had an organization. They were super awesome organization, statewide organization, and they happened to be in the financial services space. And so we were having a conversation with their executive leadership. And one of the things they said was, we realized that when we look at the profession, there are growing numbers of women who are entering into the financial advising profession. We see this in all market indicators. But when we look at our association and we look at who has been joining our association, we see that we're not actually seeing the same kinds of changes, right? In just who is joining our organization. We are not seeing more women join the organization, even though we know more women are coming into the field. And we're not exactly sure what's going on or what's happening, because we want to be a welcoming place for all of these new women who are coming into the financial advising space. And so I said, okay, that's interesting. Well, why don't we talk about your recruitment strategy, right? Why don't we talk about just a little bit, help me understand how you're recruiting people into the association. And they said, oh yeah, well, what we do is every time it's time for recruiting season, we go and we look into our networks and we just make sure that we're constantly, talking to people within our networks and really inviting them to join us. So I stopped for a minute and I just said to the group, well, do your networks look like the kind of diversity that you're looking for? Or are your networks, inviting these new women financial advisors in? And they kind of looked around at each other and they're like, no, actually not. Our networks look the same today as they did 20 years ago. And so what I said to them is I said, well, if your table is not diverse to begin with, right? Or if your network is not diverse to begin with, or wherever you're going to look for new people or to extend invitations is not reflecting what you want to see, then you can't be surprised when people are not coming in, right? When you aren't able to recruit some of that diversity from the places where you're looking. And so I said to the group, I said, you know what, let's just spend about 5 minutes doing a little bit of internet research. I said, let's just look at what's happening and if we can find or identify some new places that you could go to. And it's not to say that you shouldn't keep going to your networks. That has served you well. You get great members who come from your networks, but what can we add on top of that? And what was fascinating is within about 5 minutes of doing an internet search, we found all these different spaces where women who are financial advisors, right? So the target audience that they were looking for, were gathering on their own, right? They were doing these meetups, they were doing this other stuff because they didn't even know that this resource existed out there. And so just by doing that little 5-minute research, we were able to find a whole plethora of new places where people could go to for some of that recruiting. And what it did was it fundamentally changed the organization's ability to recruit a much more diverse group and bring new people to the table. So not only were they able to then name the exclusions, but they were able to look in new places to find people who could really support their mission of being more inclusive. Now, the next one that I want you to consider is evaluating your criteria. Now, I'm going to just take a step back and I want to acknowledge that at this moment, I often get this question around, well, when you say evaluate your criteria, are you meaning that we need to change our criteria or lower our standards? And I just want to say right now, if that flashed on anybody's mind, if anybody was about to go into the chat and ask that question, I want to make it 100% abundantly clear that that is not what I mean. When I'm talking about this idea of evaluating your criteria, what I mean is really taking a look at your criteria and determining whether or not it suffices for what you are hoping to achieve. And here is another example of what I mean by this. So again, another client, and we were working with them. And one of the things they were looking at in particular was their retention or their recruiting strategy. And they wanted to know, is there a way for us to be able to evaluate our criteria in a meaningful way, or look at how we're bringing people into the organization in a way that would really allow for us to recruit a more diverse candidate pool? And so we were looking at the criteria that they used, and I should note here that this is a manufacturing company, right? So a company that was really focused on manufacturing, and they were recruiting for people in their accounting, in the accounting part of the organization. So I remember getting the job criteria and kind of taking a look at it, and then coming back with the organization and asking a question, because one of the requirements on the criteria for this accountant position that they were hiring for said, in the job requirements, must be able to lift 40 pounds for this job. And I said to the group, so this is for an accounting role, and I'm sure that in tax season, there's a lot of paperwork that has to be picked up and moved around and all of that. But it's really hard for me to imagine, even during that season, a time where it would be a requirement for someone to be able to lift 40 pounds in order for them to be a really good accountant. Now, why is that in here? Now, of course, the organization, when they looked at it, they thought, oh my goodness, I can't believe that that's in there. But really, Deanna, that comes from the fact that we're this manufacturing company and we've had this template for the last 15 years and it's on all of the templates. And you're right, it doesn't actually apply to this job. In how many spaces are we doing exactly that same thing? Right? In how many spaces are we saying that in order for you to join or for you to be part of this table, we are using this like antiquated or completely irrelevant criteria? And let me tell you what the threat is there. If I'm a person who can't lift 40 pounds, right? And I see that that's a requirement, I'm going to self-exclude myself before I even apply for the job, right? I'm going to say, this one is not for me. Either it's not for me because I know I can't do that, or it's not for me because obviously they weren't thinking about me when they put this together. What would my experience be like if they weren't even thinking about me during the recruiting process? And so I think it's incredibly important for us to think about what is the criteria that we're looking at and how often are we looking at our criteria and how often are we refreshing our criteria? Because if we're not doing that often enough, what we might be doing inadvertently is actually eliminating full swaths of people who could be really great fits for our organizations. So my point here is when you're thinking about criteria, it's not that you should get rid of it, but you should have a consistent way to evaluate whether or not the criteria actually meets what you are looking to do. And Beth, I really appreciate your comment. You have to refresh in order to recruit. That is beautiful. I hope I can borrow it. Refresh in order to recruit. Because we can't extend invitations and people are not going to accept our invitations if we aren't making sure that we are being clear. Thanks, Beth. I appreciate it. Okay. All right. So that's kind of the first big bucket is who's at the table. The second big bucket that we wanted to talk about is what is happening at the table, right? What is happening at the table? Now, I think that this is a challenge that applies to all of us because we might say, you know what, actually, when I think about my tables, they're pretty diverse, right? We're doing a good job of making sure that we're evaluating our criteria. We're doing a good job of making sure that we're extending invitations and looking in new places and really like naming what exclusions exist. But I have to tell you that none of that actually matters if you're not also paying attention to what is happening at the table. And so let me give you three, again, simple techniques of things that you can do to make sure that what is happening at the table reflects your desires to create these inclusive tables. The very first thing to think about when you're thinking about what's happening at the table is to think about what is the kind of training that is happening when organizations are trying to create inclusive tables. Now, I'm going to give you another really important example here. A lot of times when we are talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, there is this assumption, and it's almost like this like thread, right, that happens in the background where we start to moralize our conversation around having diversity, equity, and inclusion skills. So we say, and we don't have to say this bluntly, but we do say this in kind of the way that we behave and the way that we frame up things. If you are an inclusive leader, if you have these skill sets, then you are a good person. And if you don't, you're a bad person. And I want to tell you that there's a real danger in setting up this work in those dichotomies. It's actually, if I had like a magic wand and I could like do one big thing in this space and kind of in changing the way that the sector works, this is one of the things that I would evaporate. And the reason why I would do it is because I think that it actually causes us a great deal of harm, this moralizing the idea of diversity, equity, and inclusion, instead of thinking about it as a skill set. Now, I like to use this example. I was once in front of this group of amazing people who were designers. They were all like in the technical world space, right? And everything that they do, it revolves around technology. And so I said to them, I said, hey, friends, if I was hired into your organization and technology was a huge component of my job, and I disclosed to you the following, I said, hey, you know what? Actually, my technology skills are not that great. Right? If something goes wrong with my computer, I have essentially, I think like one of three options. I can, one, turn it off and turn it back on again. Two, call one of my children who help me with all things technology. Or three, walk away from it and hope that whoever comes and sees it next will just go ahead and fix it for me, right? Like that's kind of the extent of my ability to solve or problem solve when it comes to technology. It is not part of what I've been trained on. It is not part of my skill set. But if I came into your organization and that was a requirement of my job, right? In order to be successful in my job, I had to be able to up my skill level out of those three potential solution options. What would you do? Well, you would go, right? If you wanted me to stay, you would go through a bunch of different things. You would make sure that I would get access to resources. You might mentor me. You might get me additional training. And I would feel really confident being able to say, yeah, this is not what I know, because we think about technology or technology and lack of or knowledge of, right, as a skill. But we don't do that in the diversity, equity, and inclusion space. And what ends up happening is that when people don't know, right? And we talked about one of the biggest challenges is this like lack of knowledge, feeling like you don't have enough knowledge, is that when people don't know, oftentimes what will happen is they will be afraid to ask the question, right? They'll be afraid to say like, I don't really understand. Could you help me? Or I really need some more skills. And so I think it's important that we don't make the assumption, right, that nobody makes the assumption when we start a new job that we know how to deal with and manage all of the technology on the different platforms that we're going to have to engage in. No, we're given training to do that. So the same way that we do that in these other spaces, right, as it relates to our different job duties, we have to also do that with diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so one of the things I try to encourage people to do is to make sure that they're signing up for things like this, that they're making things like this accessible to the rest of their resource team, that they're giving people the opportunity and not just making the assumption, or even worse, like putting into the moral buckets of good or bad, but that they're really thinking about this as a skill building opportunity and making sure that the training is accessible to all the different people who might be at all the different levels that they're in. So that is a huge thing about making sure that when we come to the table, we just don't assume, oh, everybody knows how to be inclusive. No, we make sure that we call it out and we give people the skill set that they need in order to do it. Now, another thing at the table, and kind of when we talk about bad behaviors or things that can be obstacles at the table, is making sure that when we invite people to the table, we're actually, and I like to call this turning on their microphones. Now, the example that I will use here is one that I hear from women all of the time, in particular with a lot of the executive women that we end up coaching. So one of the things that I will hear them say is, you know what? I get invited to the table, right? I'm maybe sitting at the table and I get really excited that I'm at the table, finally feel like I'm having a seat at the table. But oftentimes when I get there, after a couple days, couple weeks, right, a couple months in a position, I start to actually really question whether or not I should be at the table. And it's not because of my skill set, it's not because of what I can offer. It's because when I come to the table, nobody ever asks me for my opinion. Right. I don't actually get the opportunity to use my voice. Nobody hears what I have to say. The only times that my ideas are moved forward is if somebody else comes in after me and says the same thing that I did, or says it in a slightly different way. So I feel like I'm at the table, but it doesn't really matter. Like I'm just kind of, there for somebody to check a box, but not really there because of the value that I can offer. That is a terrible feeling. I know what that feels like. I'm sure many of you on this call for various different reasons know what that feels like. And so you start to feel like this is just performative and you're just using me as part of your performance. And that really takes a toll on people's ability to show up fully. It takes a toll on their ability to actually want to participate and to engage. And it takes a toll on their wanting to be there, right? We talked about how inclusion can equal retention, but it can only equal retention if people feel like they are actually invited, but also listened to. And so when we talk about turning on the microphones, there's a lot of like little techniques that I share, and actions speak louder, but there's some simple ones, right? You can do round robins. Hey, we're going to go around, make sure that everybody gets an opportunity to talk. You can do things when you are actually participating in a meeting and you notice that this is a pattern. You can actually say, hey, you know what? I kind of like to stop and pause and just make sure that, whoever the person is who might be getting talked over all the time, or whose ideas keep getting like stolen away from them, I'd really like to make sure that we give, them a chance to talk. Or actually, that's the same point that person just said a moment ago, right? Equipping yourself with some of that language that you can use and really pull out when we start to see these microphones put in front of people, but not turned on. So really thinking about what does it look like to turn on microphones, not just inviting people, but making sure that we're hearing their voice. And the last thing that I'm going to point out here, and this is a tricky one, it's super tough, it's definitely one that we find ourselves challenged with often. And this is this idea about how do we encourage dissent? So we can have a table. We can invite everybody there. We can make sure people get a lot of training. We can check all the microphones and make sure that they're turned on. But if we do not have a culture where we can also share how our diverse thinking or diverse experiences kind of influence the way that we're hearing something, it doesn't really matter. Because innovation doesn't come from a bunch of people just sitting around saying like, yeah. Oh, mic on? Yes. Just wanted to repeat. Yes, I affirm that. Where real innovation happens is when we are able to share how our different experiences and different identities and different things that we've been exposed to in our lives, how they actually influence the way that we might see an issue, an opportunity, a challenge that's in front of us. And so really making sure that we build in some systems that not only accept or tolerate dissent, but that actually encourage it. So again, I give a lot of different ideas about how you could do this in the book, but here are a couple of little tidbits to help with this. One of them is just building into the different places where you're meeting and gathering the opportunity for dissent. So one of the things that we'll say is we'll be like, hey, I want everybody, like, especially if I bring an idea to my team, I'll say, okay, great. This is my idea. But now what I want it to do is I want everybody on the team, including myself, to talk about why this is a terrible idea. Or not even that, doesn't have to be that dramatic, to talk about what are some of the things that might go wrong with this idea. And I want to give everybody the opportunity to talk about why we maybe shouldn't pursue this. Right. So what I'm doing is I'm modeling in my behavior and actually creating a system that allows for it not to have to feel personal, but allows for it to be something that is just part of what we do as a regular course of action. And I think making sure that we're creating those spaces and being really intentional about it and making sure we're building a culture around it is incredibly important to helping make sure that people do feel like they can show up completely, that people care about what they're talking about, even if it doesn't fit the status quo of what is already happening in the organization. So I know that was a lot of techniques, and I know we're kind of coming up close to the end of my opportunity to talk to you and really opening it up for some questions. But I want to make sure that I just highlight some of the big questions that you can be asking if you're sitting right now and you're thinking, I'm pumped up, I'm ready to go, I want to use my power to create more inclusive workplaces. I want to make sure that I can give you some questions that you can use to really challenge yourself on how to identify which of these tools you might bring to play. So the first question is thinking through, like, what are the exclusions? Remember, we talked about naming the exclusions. What are the social identities that are not represented? And how might we extend an invitation to those identities, right? Where are the new places that we might have to go in order to extend that invitation? What does it look like? So that's challenge number one. The second challenge I want you to think about is, are we thinking about things from other people's perspectives? Right? When we're talking about what's happening at the table and we're talking about what's going on, are we making sure that we're not just using our own perspective, our own lens to think about what's happening? How do different people from different social identities show up at that table, and what does it look like for them? And really thinking through that, because that is how we build that empathy muscle, but it's also how we build that inclusion muscle. Because the more we can start thinking about things, not just from our own perspective, but also from the perspective of others, the more likely we're going to be able to set inclusive tables. Another question is, what do we need to change in order to be more inclusive? Remember, I gave you the example here of how do we actually evaluate our criteria? What are the things that we're looking at, and what are the things that we are going to as our places, right, for being able to decide who we're inviting or who we're not inviting? And how do we shake that up? How do we make shaking that up a regular part of our activity, a regular part of what we are doing on within our organizations, within our table building strategies? And then last but certainly not least, have we emphasized the importance of diversity and equity and inclusion with our team? And have we moved away from this idea of moralizing this and really moving towards an opportunity to think about these as skill sets? How do we encourage people to think about this as another skill to add to your toolkit, as opposed to something that they feel like they have to be really defensive about, or really offensive about, right? Like really on the like, oh my gosh, I can learn everything, I got to do everything. And more so like, no, calm down. Let's just make sure that we're thinking about this as a tool that we think the same way that we think about all the other tools that are important in our leadership toolkit. So these are some questions and some challenges for you. But I didn't forget, friends. I know I promised you I would return back to the story. So what did I do in that situation where I was told by the other CEO that I needed to bring a white man with me to the board meeting in order for us to get a favorable vote? Well, I have to tell you, it was a really, really hard moment for me. I remember the day that it happened. I came home and I started talking to my husband, who's a very, very attentive listener. He was actually at the stove, and he had his phone out, and I thought he was just like looking at a recipe because he was making dinner. But we started to have this conversation back and forth, and I was using a lot of interesting words because I was upset, right? And I was frustrated and I was mad. I was, as my kids say, I was in my feelings. But we kind of started this exchange, and it went back and forth for about 45 minutes. And he said to me, Deanna, it kind of sounds like this other time. And he mentioned another time in my career. And then I said, yeah, it kind of reminds me of this. And we went back and forth like this for only about 45 minutes. And then that phone that I thought he was taking notes on or looking at for the recipe, he actually handed it to me. And what he had done in that 45 minutes is he had documented 27 other times in my career where I was implicitly or kind of explicitly told the exact same thing. So the first thing that I did was I sat with that for a while and thought about, what I would do with that list. Because one of the things that I realized is that while those were stories that were particular to me, they weren't just about me, right? They were stories that I see happening every single day in places all over the world. And so I started to think, how could these stories actually turn into something that could change the kind of culture that we are experiencing? And so that this stuff doesn't keep happening to other people, that other people aren't sitting, at their kitchen table fraught with all these different negative feelings. And quite honestly, that's what became the basis of Actions Speak Louder, which is the book that I just put out. Now, that story is not in the book, ironically, but there's many other stories that are in the book that really helped spur how do we kind of reverse some of these behaviors. So that's one thing that I ended up doing. I didn't know sitting at the table that that's what was going to happen, but it certainly was the kind of catalyst for that book coming to life. But the second thing that I had to do was I had to make a decision, right? I had to decide, am I going to go forward with this deal or am I going to stop? And I have to tell you that if I didn't have a time clock ticking in the background, I probably would still be pondering what the right decision was. Because there are definitely moments where I come back to it and wonder, like, did I make the right decision? What I ended up deciding to do was I didn't take a white man with me, but I did take a white woman with me. And I told her what was going on. I told her what happened. I told her, how I was feeling and how I felt really torn about it. But I also recognized that in that moment, there was something bigger than kind of my own feelings, right? That there was something bigger, even though my dignity, I feel like, was definitely attacked, there was something bigger at stake. There was an opportunity to have a really transformational change, not only in that organization, but in the community that was going to benefit from having this investment. And so I remember, I went to this meeting and I honestly went to the meeting still hopeful. I was still hopeful that when I got there, that it would be super welcoming and there wouldn't be any of these undertones of, not feeling welcomed. But when I got there, nobody shook my hand. Nobody greeted me. Nobody said, it introduced themselves. I had to do all of that. I was not sat at the head of the table. I was moved to the side, even though I was the one putting the presentation on. All the questions were directed at my white colleague, even though she had no idea really anything about the project besides the little that I had told her. And I had to answer all the questions. And so it was really disheartening to actually in real time also experience exactly what the CEO was talking about and what the CEO was trying to warn me about in recommending that I bring somebody else with me. But we did get a unanimous approval. And what I will tell you is that in that moment, I realized a couple of things. Number one, I realized that while I might have felt going into that conversation that my power was being stripped of me, that I needed to think about the bigger picture, that actually in getting that unanimous vote, it also made us the largest investor of that organization, which dramatically increased my power over what was happening in the organization. Now, I don't throw power around like willy-nilly, but in that moment, it was important for me to help the board know after the vote went through and we were moving forward, just exactly what happened. And I helped them understand, like, this is all the stuff that was put at jeopardy. And I almost walked away from this deal. And because I had this new space and because we were able to have these dialogues, we were able to move that board along in their own conversation and really awareness, because they weren't even aware that that was what they were doing, right? And how they were creating this environment that was so exclusionary. And so there was also power in being able to do that. And the last thing that I'll just share is that that organization, did exactly what we thought it was going to do. They were able to make incredible gains as a result of the work that they do. And I still have people who will come up to me who know that I was part of that deal and that transaction, who will come up to me and hug me and tell me how their entire life trajectory was changed as a result of that investment in our community. And so I feel really good about the final decision. But I have to tell you that it did cause like a lot of that discernment, right? Of how do I in this moment not think about this as a moment of my power being stripped from me, but how do I in this moment shift that perspective and really think about the power that I still do have? And so that is what I'm going to leave you all with, right? I'm going to leave you all with this big thought. When we are thinking about power and we're thinking about inclusion and we're thinking about how we show up, I think it's important to remember we actually all have power. We all have spheres of influence where we get to decide how people are going to feel. So that's actually not a question. We actually all have the power to be inclusive. But what is a question is, are we going to use it? Are we going to use it? And my hope is that you would make sure that you take your actions, you take your day-to-day practices, you take the things and places that you get to show up in, and that you use those moments to create the kind of inclusion that will help us change the world. Thank you. Now what I'd love to do is open it up for questions.
All right, if you can, when we stop sharing screen, thank you, Deanna, that was amazing. Let's do a big virtual applause.
Oh, thank you so much. I appreciate you.
Let your questions come through, please. We do have one question already up, and I'm going to actually ask Tiki. I'm gonna make it so that, or at least I'm gonna try to make it so that you can speak and ask your question live, Tiki. So just give me 1 second to do that. Here we go. And Tiki, you are allowed to talk. Please ask your question.
Thank you. I was afraid you were about to turn my camera on too. I'm like, good thing
No, I wouldn't do that to anybody.
I am ready for camera just in case. But no, I know we talk a lot about inclusiveness, and a lot of organizations are trying to move in that direction. I'm just wondering, like, is there a way that we can actually measure inclusiveness, right? Like those efforts, because I know our organization, that's where I struggle a lot of times, where I see that I'm like, well, how would you know? I mean, you can't just say, well, we have this many people who are in this position or that, but how can you really measure inclusion? Because just, using your example, you were there, you were part of the conversation, but someone warned you that you needed to bring someone else. So if you hadn't received that information, maybe you would have thought you were included, but you truly weren't. You know what I mean? So I don't know if there's anything that you might be able to share to help us better.
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, thank you so much for your question. I really appreciate it. It's a great question, right? And it is one that I think the reason why it can be challenging for organizations is because there is no clear-cut answer to it, right? And so one of the things that I always tell an organization when we first get started, one of the first things that we do, especially with our consulting organizations, is we start with, what are you trying to achieve, right? What does success actually look like for you? Because you could throw out all kinds of different metrics or things that you could use, employee engagement surveys, number of people in an organization, people participation, I mean, all kinds of different things. But the only ones that really are going to matter are the ones that really reflect the mission and vision and values that you have as an organization. So I think that the first question before you can ask, like, what are the measures, is like, what are we trying to achieve, right? Or what actually are we trying to get to? And once we can get clarity on that, then it becomes a lot easier to think about what are the inclusion metrics that would allow for us to know whether or not we have traction or we don't have traction. I think another thing to realize, and this is one, I'm like a data geek. So one of the things that I love to do, are you kidding me? Like, give me some Excel documents, give me some statistics, like let me read a research report or somebody's dissertation. It's like one of my happy places, right? So I love, 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 love the research. But the research, again, only has as much value in its ability to connect to what the long-term strategic or objectives are. And so that's where I think sometimes we miss the mark, is that we either arbitrarily come up with a bunch of different things, or we look at what another organization does and then we try to like replicate what they're doing, as opposed to just like using that as guidance, as opposed to actually starting with like, where are we at and where are we trying to get to? So I hope that, kind of gives them some insight into it, but it actually is more a question to me about what is the process, and less of that there's a definitive answer around how you measure inclusion.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
And
you.
I'm going to have a question for you. We like to always leave like this one thing. So if there was one thing that you could recommend and give our participants today, and of course, people who are watching it later, what is the one action that they could use today to move closer to accepting a kinder world that embraces D&I?
I'm going to answer your question, but with two things. The first thing I would say and highly recommend is to pick up the book. Now, the reason why I'm doing that is because obviously I want more people, out there engaging in the material and helping me learn more and all of that. But also because that was my big intention, Brent, one of the things that I recognized in doing this work is that I've never met anybody who's like, I want to be exclusionary. I don't want people to thrive in my organization. I don't, I never have heard that. What I have heard people say is, I would love to create a more inclusive workplace, but I don't actually know what that means. I don't know what it looks like. And so really what I tried to do in the book, and this has been all the feedback that we've gotten, this is like every word, every page was taken under this light and with this scope. Is it something that's actionable that people can actually do in their organizations? So I don't just say that as like a prompt for the book, although prompt for the book, I'd love to have you read it. But I say it because it is meant to be able to help you razor focus on what are some of the priorities that we have in our organization, what are some steps that we can take that would make the most sense for us, and how do I even engage in this conversation to get people alongside me. So I try to do all that work for you. That's one thing. The second thing that I would do is I would really encourage you to think about your day. And one of the exercises we even put in the book is think about your day and think about all the different things that happen during your day, the meetings that you go to, how you get into the building, who you talk to regularly. And think about these moments where you can actually add micro inclusions, right? Maybe you say hi, like my son did, to every person you see on the way to your office. Just that one little thing could make a huge difference. Maybe you think about in the meetings, that you're going to make it your job to make sure that you're getting a round robin going. Or maybe you encourage the team lead to say, hey, can we change who the leader is of each of our meetings so that we get more voices at the table? Whatever it might be, really making sure that you come up with a plan that's specific to yourself. Now, a lot of times people will say, but I want to talk about the big organizational things. And that is great. We should definitely be having that conversation too, but it's not an either or, it has to be an and. You have to be thinking about the things that you're modeling in your day-to-day behaviors, in addition to some of the larger, big things that are happening as part of the bigger group. Trina, thanks for buying the book.
All right. Well, but how can they do that?
Oh, I mean, it's available everywhere. So wherever you purchase your books regularly, you can find Actions Speak Louder. The other thing that I would encourage you to do, and I really appreciate Tandra mentioning connecting with us on LinkedIn, because that is a free resource. We love to be able to put out really great content, and we're very, very particular about making sure that we're resourcing people. So it's not just trying to get you to buy the book. I just want to give information. We have this thing, we like to give graciously, that's one of our core philosophies as an organization. So it's not about the purchase. It's more about, I did this for you. I did this work. I really want you to have it. And I want it to help you in whatever ways you see fit. So that's how you do it.
Excellent. So if anyone has a question, please raise your hand. We can bring you live to talk because we don't have any questions in the queue. But Tandra did put the Amazon link in there. Is that the best place to go, Deanna, or should we go directly to your website maybe?
Really, you can go any place that you buy books. I always try and encourage people to support their local bookstores or to support their bookstores that are owned by marginalized groups, but also appreciate the support that we've gotten from Amazon over the past too. So thank you.
All right. Anyone else have any questions? All right, well, I'm going to pass it back over to the amazing Tandra Richardson and to close us out. So here we go.
Thank you, Brent. And thank you, Deanna, for such a wonderful presentation. I think everyone will probably be running to purchase the book. I did actually purchase the American Girl book while we were during the webinar because I didn't catch that one. I was like, ooh. So that is actually probably, I haven't read it yet, but I'll be reading it soon. But that's probably a good resource to offer to everyone as well when you're thinking about your children. I mean, how often are you getting these questions? I did imagine, Deanna, that you get them often with, how do I talk to my kids about racism? And diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging is being mentioned so frequently with kids asking those questions, or even your children modeling them as you explained during your presentation. So Thank you again for that. Thank you all for joining us. We want to also let you all know that the work that we do here at DLA would not be possible without the important contributions from our Executive Director, Joanna Deshay, our tireless group of dedicated volunteers, sponsors, and our esteemed Board of Director members. I wanted to give some recognition to a few key people that were responsible for today's program. A very special thank you to Education Committee members Olga Diaz and Dr. Brent Scholar and Maria Radloff, our amazing webmaster. We would not be able to do the work that we do without the support of our amazing sponsors that help to underwrite programs such as the webinar session you attended today. Thank you to Mayo Clinic and Mr. Marion Kelly, and also a special thanks to the Tegna Foundation, Channel 10, and the support of board member Ms. Kate Morris, the general manager. If you've enjoyed today's workshop and content, please consider supporting DLA further by making a donation. Your financial contribution helps us continue these vital dialogues and also helps keep access to workshops and content like this complimentary to the community. In the chat area is the link to click and make your donations online. DLA is a 501c3 nonprofit organization. Your donations may be tax deductible. Please consult your tax advisor. Again, we do hope to see you at our annual conference. Registration is open and more information coming soon. Please check the DLA website, follow us on Facebook and LinkedIn for more information on the events. Again, a very special thank you to you, Deanna, with Uplifting Impact, and a very special thank you to all of you, our attendees, for your time and attention today. Thank you for joining us at this new time this month, and enjoy the rest of your morning and your afternoons. Goodbye.